Hello, I'm Peter Bogdonavich, speaking to you from Cohen Media Channel. Of the 6 films I've been asked to introduce you to, all are very much worth your time if you're interested in the movies as a form of art and not just a passing fancy. 2 of these pictures are by the Dutch-German director Douglas Sirk, born Hans Detlev Sierck in 1897, a contemporary, therefore, of such American directors as John Ford and Howard Hawks. After an artistically estimable and quite successful career as a director in the German theater, as well as impressively directing nearly a dozen films in Europe, Sirk came to America in the late 30s. His first movie here was the very timely Hitler's Madman, released in 1943. We are going to show you his 3rd and 4th American films, both very different from each other, but with the same underlying intelligence and a subtle wit. In 1965, when I first saw Sirk's A Scandal in Paris, also known sometimes as Thieves' Holiday, it had been a modest 1946 release. For my personal card file on every movie I've seen from 1952 through 1970, after rating the picture good plus, I wrote, "Charming, witty, and excellently designed and directed, acted and written period comedy melodrama about a suave criminal who inveigles himself into Parisian society and gets appointed police chief. But the love of a good girl stops his otherwise flawless plot to break the bank." George Sanders, Senia Hasso, Akim Tamirov, Gene Lockhart, everyone is fine. Very able Sirk work, unquote. Today, I would probably rate the film somewhat higher, as at least very good plus or even excellent. Utterly dry and unpretentiously intellectual, the direction matches the sophisticated understatement of star George Sanders' performance. In fact, Sirk and Sanders obviously got along very well together, since Sirk's next picture, Lured, that's L-U-R-E-D, from 1947, again starred George Sanders, though it is a totally different kind of film, a suspenseful crime melodrama, which I also first saw in 1965. A solid 238 movies before seeing A Scandal in Paris. This was a couple of years prior to directing my first picture, so I was still learning by watching a lot of films. After a rating for Lured of very good, which today would instead be excellent, I wrote, quote, "Shadowy, very well directed and acted thriller about a homicidal killer of women who sends poems patterned after Baudelaire to Scotland Yard just before he is to finish his next victim." Some typically dark Sirkian humor and a perverse, sophisticated approach, well carried out by George Sanders, Lucille Ball, Cedric Hardwicke, Charles Coburn, and Boris Karloff, unquote. It's a little odd seeing Lucille Ball in this kind of showgirl role, but after the initial shock wears off, she's quite okay. And the Baudelaire references seem to fit Sirk's European personality just right. Alfred Hitchcock's last English film and his first American movie were both based on stories by the same author, Daphne du Maurier. But while Rebecca won the Best Picture Oscar for 1940, Jamaica Inn from 1939 never won a thing. It was one of the director's weakest projects, but even weak Hitchcock is more interesting than many a director's best. I saw it in 1954, and after a tepid rating of good plus, I wrote, quote, "Charles Laughton gives such a marvelously theatrical performance in this movie that one is almost made to disregard the rather melodramatic aspects of Miss du Maurier's tale of period piracy and plunder. Hitchcock's direction is quite skillful, and the other actors are effectively grotesque. But this is Mr. Laughton's picture, memorable only because of his wicked, gross, and devilish characterization," unquote. I discussed the film with Hitchcock once, and he said, "Jamaica Inn was nothing but the parson who preaches on Sunday and wrecks ships during the week. By casting Laughton in this part, you're saying all during the week, who is it? Who's doing these things? And you can only come to one conclusion. It must be Laughton. I mean, it was fatal." When Hitchcock first hit the screen in England in the late 20s, he was sometimes referred to as the English Fritz Lang, the the German director, also often associated with crime and suspense pictures. Eventually, however, Hitchcock's success and fame turned Lang into the German Alfred Hitchcock. Lang had come to America in the 30s, made some pretty powerful films. One of these, released in 1943, was Hangmen Also Die, which I underrated a bit when I first saw it in 1962, scoring at very good plus and writing, quote, completely Langian wartime suspense melodrama about the killing of Heydrich and the Czechs who protect the assassin during the Nazi occupation. Particularly well acted by the supporting cast, the film is superbly directed, strikingly photographed, and well written. Powerful and exciting, personal and not marred by the propagandism of the time because of its conviction and the director's personality, unquote. The first great American screen hero was the dashing, irrepressible Douglas Fairbanks, who notoriously did all his own stunts and was a brash, optimistic, and thoroughgoing delight. He was both Orson Welles' and Laurence Olivier's favorite movie actor. A major star since 1917, Fairbanks started out doing comedies and westerns, but moved on to swashbucklers with the great success of The Mark of Zorro in 1920. Doug's third movie of this kind is the one we're showing you, The Thief of Baghdad from 1924, directed by the fabulous Raoul Walsh, who had been making pictures since 1914 and was the perfect filmmaker for Doug Fairbanks. I first saw this picture in 1959, gave it too low a rating, good minus, and wrote, quote, the huge sets are fantastic, overwhelming. The effects work very well, and Douglas Fairbanks exudes warmth, good humor, optimism, and tremendous physical prowess. When romancing, of which there is too much in this picture, he is not at his most accomplished. But despite its adverse length, 130 minutes, the thin plot, the static spots, the film is continuously engrossing, often delightful, and the photographic tricks and sets influenced by the German filmmakers are most impressive, unquote. Apparently, I didn't know at that time about one of the most troublesome elements in the making and exhibiting of silent pictures. The speed was variable. It wasn't fixed at 24 frames per second until sound made that essential. So sometimes a movie filmed at 21 frames per second is exhibited at 16 frames per second, which deadeningly slows the footage. Or a film shot at 16 frames per second is shown at 21 frames a second, speeding the footage into a silly overdrive, an era emblematic of the look to most people of all silent films. Therefore, by 1964, when I saw The Thief of Baghdad for a second time, I had learned this upsetting technical fact, and no doubt the speed this time was more appropriate to the picture. I added to the film's card, quote, Fairbanks belongs in the Walsh tradition of adventurers, purified by love. And although this is not Walsh at his surest or best, it is a good deal of fun, particularly in the last hour when the story starts moving. In 1915, D.W. Griffith's epoch-making film, The Birth of a Nation, became the first gigantic blockbuster in movie history. Still the movie seen by the most people in the world. The first picture ever shown at the White House, President Wilson's reaction, quote, "It is like writing history with lightning," unquote. In fact, no one had made such a powerful film, so brilliantly directed, an epic that was both intimate and grand, realistic and theatrical. There were, however, numerous objections to Griffith's questionable portrayal of the Reconstruction era and to the definite racism behind the work. But Griffith was a man of the South, and his view is decidedly prejudiced. Though close examination of national publications like the New York Times or the Boston Globe proves that this whole country was, at that time, largely racist. Griffith was deeply hurt by some of the reactions to this work, felt not only misunderstood, but that he definitely had been a victim of a kind of intolerance. And so, using his own money from his profits on The Birth of a Nation, he made the most far-reaching and daring picture of his career. I first saw Intolerance in 1958, gave it a top rating of exceptional, and wrote, quote, In this literally colossal work, the first of the super spectacles and the most gigantic of them all, Griffith set out to show the effect and tragedy of intolerance through the ages, as seen during 4 separate periods of history: Babylonia in 539 BC, Judea in 27 AD, France in 1572, and America in 1914. Developing each story, he slowly interweaves them until the 4 merge into a kind of cinematic fugue, a tour de force staggering the imagination, particularly when one realizes it is the creation of one man's vision. Among the greatest films in movie history, and certainly Griffith's most ambitious achievement, unquote. An unmentioned hero in regard to 2 of the pictures we're presenting is the pioneer director Alan Dwan. Alan was extremely influential in creating the persona and essential character of Doug Fairbanks, having directed quite a few of the early Fairbanks pictures, which set the tone and personality of the star. Modestly, Dwan always said that he used to just go see Griffith's movies and simply do exactly what he did. However, while making Intolerance, for which Griffith had built gigantic sets, D.W. wanted to be able to move forward with the camera and up at the same time, what came to be known as a crane shot. But there were no cranes in 1916. So Griffith asked Alan Dwan, who was an engineer, if he had any idea how to accomplish this vision. Alan said, sure, and he put an elevator on a railroad track and is therefore responsible for the first crane shot in motion pictures.